Hello, everybody. Thank you, Evan, and thank you to the Linda Hall Library and the IRC. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Rachael Bale, and like Evan said, I've been covering the wildlife trade for almost 10 years. And when I started, I didn't know a lot about it, but it very quickly became clear that it's more than just a conservation story. The illegal wildlife trade is an overlooked crisis. It lives at the nexus of conservation, organized crime, international relations, and science. So tonight we're going to hear from experts from these different fields who will help us understand and explore this complexity. No one knows for sure how much the illegal wildlife trade is worth because it's a black market, a black box. But it's often said to be on par with drugs trafficking, arms, human trafficking. If you include fish and timber, which you should, it's many billions of dollars. The UNODC estimated in 2016 it was up to $23 billion a year. And that's because wildlife is so much more than just the iconic animals that NGOs put on their logos. For sure, poaching of elephants for their ivory and rhinos for their horn is a significant and very brutal part of it. But think of any wild animal, and I guarantee you there's an illegal trade for it. Some people collect reptiles the way kids collect Pokemon cards. They just want a whole lot of them, or maybe they want the rarest, even if, or especially if they're illegal. Other people are the same with bugs and spiders. I once did an investigation into the trafficking of cheetah cubs, and that's mainly the people who buy them are ultra-rich people in Gulf countries who want to keep them as pets and add them to their collections of exotic animals, which often include lions and tigers and even orangutans. Wealth and desire are big drivers of the illegal wildlife trade. Sorry, wealth and the desire to show off are big drivers of the illegal wildlife trade. Have any of you guys seen the show Succession? So there's this scene where Tom and Greg put the napkins over their heads and they eat a whole songbird. Those are ortolans, which are illegal to trap and eat. And Tom tells Greg something like, "Here's the thing about being rich. You get to do whatever you want, and the authorities can't do anything about it." Plants fall into that category too. You may be familiar with the book or movie The Orchid Thief, or have seen headlines about people poaching saguaro in Arizona or succulents from the coast of California. So despite all of this, wildlife trafficking remains a low-risk, high-reward enterprise. So here's an example from the US, which does take wildlife trafficking much more seriously than many other countries in the world. So this is Anson Wong. He's a Malaysian man who headed a major reptile smuggling ring. He was only arrested after a years-long international investigation, and he admitted to crimes that carried a maximum penalty of 250 years in prison and $12.5 million in fines. A US judge sentenced him to 71 months, that's less than 6 years, and about $60,000 in fines. It's like a parking ticket for somebody who's raking in millions of dollars a year. And remember, this is in the United States, where we do take wildlife trafficking seriously. So I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear that Anson Wong was out of prison a few years later and back to smuggling reptiles. Wildlife trafficking receives a fraction of the public resources that are devoted to fighting other types of trafficking, even though we know we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. We know that Ebola and COVID-19 were spread by the wildlife trade, even though we know that illegal wildlife trade finances other criminal activities. And we know that wildlife trade exploits the most vulnerable in society. Still, fraction of the public resources. So that's why tonight, you're not going to hear poach the poachers from any of us. And that's because the poachers are at the very bottom of the criminal supply chain. They're typically living in poverty in rural areas with very few economic options. And that's in large part because of climate change. They can no longer get by only growing crops or raising livestock. So imagine for a moment that you are struggling day to day to feed your family. And then imagine somebody comes along and offers you a month's salary just to help them sneak into a national park so they could shoot a rhino or trap a few birds. Taking out poachers does very little to stop wildlife trafficking, just as arresting drug mules doesn't do much to stop drug trafficking. As opposed to drug trafficking, though, the trafficked goods in this case are living, feeling beings. So we're not here tonight to make a statement on hunting or eating meat or otherwise using wild animals for human purposes, but I always think it's important to keep in mind the suffering that underlies the wildlife trade. Animals feel pain. Animals have emotions. And it's not just the ones we relate most to, like chimpanzees and elephants, but it's also birds and reptiles and amphibians, and yes, fish. So that's what I was thinking about when I saw these 5 cheetah cubs brought into a court as evidence in a wildlife trafficker's trial. He had put them in a woven plastic bag in the back of an SUV and driven them 10 hours across unpaved roads in Somaliland. We should all care about wildlife trafficking because, like I said, it isn't simply about loving animals or saving the environment. This is a hugely complicated issue that touches every aspect of society in every country in the world. I'm very passionate about it, and so I'm so happy to see people here tonight who are also very interested in learning more. Combating the illegal wildlife trade requires equally complex and multifaceted solutions. And so that's why tonight's panelists have very different backgrounds: law enforcement, public policy, and science, so that we can have an in-depth conversation about the scope and the implications of the illegal wildlife trade. And so I would like to introduce the panel. We have Chris Aldrich, a special agent with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service who oversees wildlife crime investigations across the Midwest. Come on up, Chris. We have Vanda Felbab-Brown, a national security and foreign policy analyst at the Brookings Institution and an expert on transnational organized crime. And Andy Rhyne, who is joining us on Zoom. He's a marine biologist who specializes in using science and technology to ensure the trade in aquarium species is sustainable. He'll be joining us on screen shortly. So thank you, everybody. And there's Andy.
Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Andy. So let's see. To start, people are often surprised to hear that the United States is a significant importer and exporter of wildlife. So Chris or Andy, what are some of the ways that the US is involved in the wildlife trade, both legal and illegal? And what are some of the surprising species that people might not think about? Let's start with Andy.
Yeah. Sure. So thank you for, there's a slight echo, so I'm going to mute myself. But thanks for inviting me, and I apologize for not being here in person. I'm unfortunately infected with COVID-19, so I'm feeling the impacts of a zoonotic disease right now through the wildlife trade. But for me, I think the U.S. is a very large importer of species, both live and also parts and derivatives. And I work in the live markets mostly of what's imported, whether it's aquarium fish. We import a lot of invertebrates, a lot of biomedical species, and we also import a tremendous number of wildlife parts and derivatives of species that are used for all kinds of products. And some of these species are used for commercial purposes, and then many are held in private collections.
Chris, what are some maybe surprising species that people don't realize here in the U.S. are traded?
I guess some of the surprising species would be, like pallid sturgeon or lake sturgeon for the roe, for their caviar. So most people wouldn't know that they might think it's expensive in the store, but not worth $350 an ounce, right? Ginseng, coming from the woods in the area that we're in, worth millions of dollars. Turtles, from even Kansas City area, box turtles, worth millions of dollars in one investigation alone. So those are things that our wildlife inspectors handle at the ports all the time. They facilitate legal trade, but they're also looking for the smuggled trade, live parts and or live animals and dead parts, right? So that's some.
So aside from pets and like supplement, like health things like ginseng, what are other reasons for the legal wildlife trade in the U.S.?
For legal purposes?
Legal, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So there's like mink farms and things that would have them come in from different places. So there are certain types of fur and other sustainable, fish that comes and goes, as well as even caviar that's sustainable from legal sources that would come in and be monitored by our our wildlife inspectors at the ports, to name a few. But
yeah. So, turning to zoonotic diseases, obviously the public is paying more attention than ever to the spread to animal-borne diseases like COVID-19 and Ebola. So, Vanda, let's talk to you next. What role does the wildlife trade play in the spread of zoonotic diseases, and how worried should we be about it?
Well, we should be very worried. So we have gotten into this habit of talking about COVID-19 as one in a 100-year episode. In fact, we have zoonosis happening very frequently, and every 3 or 5 years we have the emergence of a zoonotic disease that becomes very worrisome. Before just the last two that you mentioned, Ebola and COVID-19, we had SARS, we had Merck, we have a variety of bird flus or flu varieties. It was the pig flu, for example, between Mexico and the United States about a decade and a half ago. All of which are diseases that jump among animals and eventually jump from animals to humans. So wildlife trade, both the legal and illegal aspects, are major sources of zoonosis and major vectors of spreading the virus to humans and across wide sets of the globe. And the big catastrophe of COVID is, of course, the death toll. Let's just remember that more than 30 million people died worldwide as a result of COVID, and this is a probably significant undercount. More than 200 million people were pushed back into poverty in just the initial months of COVID, a number that's far higher today. Many of them will not be able to make it out of poverty in their lifetimes. So 25 years of global development efforts were wiped out in just initial few months of COVID. There's massive economic repercussions, massive social repercussions, and of course public health repercussions. And the death toll in the United States is well over several million, 3.6 at this point, from just COVID, with 3 million people dying just last year of COVID in the United States. So zoonoses are a really big thing. There are many vectors of them. Deforestation is an important one. But both the legal trade and illegal trade are significant factors. And of course, the promise of the legal trade is that there will be inspections. Now, Chris, correct me, but my understanding is that at the US-Mexico border, we are able to inspect 5% of the legal trade that makes it across the border. And of course, in the illegal trade, the inspection is even far lesser.
Yeah, Chris, can you tell us a little bit about what the inspection process is like when animals that are declared, when we know animals or animal parts are coming across the border, and what the challenges are?
Sure. Like if someone's abiding by the law and things come in legally, they would contact our inspectors at the ports of entry, and they would say that, hey, a shipment's coming in, and the inspectors would inspect it and make sure it's the right species. They have their permits, that they came in from the right country. Again, if all the paperwork's legal and accurate, which oftentimes it isn't, there's a lot of false labeling going on there's areas in the countries where things are legal to come from. And so they'll say this species is coming from that country when actually it's coming from another one, or commingled. Imagine that now times shipments, of containers that we never get to inspect because there's tens of thousands of them every year. And there's species in there that we never even see because they inspect a portion of it to make it.
And we were talking earlier about how inspections of imports in a lot of ways are divided among different federal agencies as well, which further complicates things.
Correct. Actually during COVID, I kind of raised my hand and said, is there a way, my headquarters said, go ahead, but to try to collect all the different scientific groups, all the different agencies that worked with importing wildlife. CDC looks at monkey stuff. USDA looks at birds coming in, and they don't all talk because they're doing their mission the way they're supposed to, but they're not kind of funneling it to us or saying, hey, look at this, where the trade's coming from, and maybe look into the actual trafficking part of it or illegal paperwork that's done with it. So there are a lot of agencies that don't necessarily talk well because they're not designed to.
Yep, Rachel.
Is that an echo?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
Rachel, I would just like to add to that, and I think it would surprise people to know that we don't know the species that we're actually importing. We only know a small fraction of the actual species that we're importing. Most of the species we import, or a lot of them, are listed under very generic codes in the data systems that are kept, and so the U.S. government can't tell anyone right now what species we're importing into the country. And when you're thinking about risk of biodiversity loss or zoonotic diseases, just having some foundational level of data on what you're importing and exporting is really important.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So as we're talking about the legal wildlife trade and the issues, or how easily you can mislabel things on paperwork, I'd like to talk about the complications of when you have a legal wildlife trade existing alongside an illegal one. So for example, Chris, you had mentioned there's plenty of caviar that is traded illegally, but we also have caviar that is legal. What kind of complications does that pose? What does that look like in practice?
On its face value, it's almost impossible to address unless you work it undercover, which is what kind of U.S. Fish and Wildlife special agents do. That's our thing, is to try to penetrate the market and then work our way up the chain. We can buy and sell wildlife so we can actually see, as I work as a wholesaler undercover, what's actually legal and what's not legal. And I can document it as I move up the chain to try to get the highest people in the chain. So like fish is a very good one. The caviar there's sturgeon farms out in California that it's legal to have that sturgeon, but then they're also getting them from the lakes and the streams, let's say, and funneling it through their business, and then they're calling it legal. So if you didn't know any better, you're eating caviar that's actually legal and illegal, unless we penetrate that to buy that caviar and take it to our lab and forensically test it and say that this caviar came from the Midwest or whatever, and not from a California farm. We're not able to do that. And this happens with sea cucumber. There's legal sea cucumber trade, but there's also commingled in there a whole bunch of illegal sea cucumber, as well, just to name a few things.
Yeah, we often refer to that as the same way you launder money. You launder wildlife through means that look legal. I know, Andy, that's something that you've worked on too, right?
Yes, I I've worked heavily in looking at the data around imports, and this commingling is so common, I think, and it's probably common in lots of different trades. But with wildlife, I think anytime you have a market for wildlife, you're always going to have some portion of illegal trade inside of legal trade. And I think that portion probably has something to do with the value of those organisms or the regulations involved or how rare they are. But and I think it's important for people to understand I would say there's illegal is also kind of a gray area, and it's not black and white. There are shipments that come into the United States that maybe have small technical problems in paperwork that are technically illegal, but then there are smuggled shipments, and corals is a really good example of that. If somebody doesn't have the right species name or something listed, that can be seized or confiscated or asked to be basically abandoned. Or a coral could be, say, smuggled from Cambodia or Indonesia through Vietnam and then into the United States and mislabeled. And so those are two different types of illegal wildlife, but they're very, very different in their aspects, and they have different effects on the ecosystems. But I think anytime you have a large trade in something, it's going to put a lot of pressure on inspectors and wildlife agents to be able to determine what is legal and what is not legal. And I think interdictions are so important when it comes to looking at demand and where that's coming from and some of the suppliers. But it's a very diffuse trade as well. I think that's part of the issue is that you have a lot of interconnections inside of the trade, and you have a few really small choke points of where all of this traffic is coming in and out of. And so where you choose to try to set up those operations and investigations can really impact your ability to kind of infiltrate some of these supply lines.
So I want to back up for a second. You were talking about coral smuggling, which I think is something I definitely before I did this job would have never thought of. Who is smuggling coral? And how big of a business is that?
Yeah, corals are such an interesting case study in the trade. Corals have been traded for decades, either as curios. People have dried corals on, maybe as a decoration, and then it moved into a live coral market for the aquarium trade. And corals now are propagated throughout the world, and they're also traded very legally in some countries, and they're sustainably traded. But because corals can be very, very lucrative and worth a lot of money, and there is some permitting and they're CITES regulated, so they require some international permits and paperwork. It's a lot easier to just sometimes smuggle those, and sometimes the species that people want are not necessarily legal from the countries they're coming from. And so there's a very large aquarium market for corals. There's a very large community of people inside the United States growing corals now in their basements and trading those with themselves. So I think corals is really emblematic of the broader wildlife trade.
And Andy just mentioned CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And it's a mouthful.
It isn't.
That is the international agreement that just about every country on Earth has signed, and it lays out agreements about how animals are going to be traded, which ones you're not going to trade, basically to try to protect animals. So when we have Okay, so the issue here then, when we have a legal trade alongside an illegal trade, is that it's very easy to launder illegal things. So what about, Vanda, what happens if we just said, okay, let's make it all legal so that we can actually just know what's going through?
So let me a little bit flip the question and I'll come to let's make it all legal. Let me explain why we don't want to make all trade in wildlife illegal. Consumption of wild meat, protein, fish is a crucial part of food access for very many people. Fish protein is critical for supplying humanity at the size that we have it and for sustaining humanity. for people who lived in forests, so-called forest-dependent community, several 100 million people, often being able to hunt and gather food in the wild is the only way they actually have enough food to survive. There are very significant economic benefits that can come to countries at the national level from accessing natural resources, whether it's timber, plants, or wildlife. So there are just basic survival reasons why we want to keep some legal trade in wildlife. There are national economic needs. And there is also a very important aspect of preserving natural ecosystems. There are three different schools of thought of how you deal with the illegal trade in wildlife, but one school of thought that focuses on economics says that wildlife stays, wildlife survives if wildlife pays. If people, communities, governments have an interest in preserving natural ecosystems, because they derive economic benefits out of it, they will preserve the ecosystem, the species with it. If they derive no economic benefits out of it, they'll just slaughter the trees in the Amazon, they'll burn down the savanna and are growing soybeans or other agricultural crops. So economic incentives are very, very important aspects of preserving natural habitats and preserving species as long as it's sustainable, which is something that Andy mentioned. Now let me come to your questions. Why not make everything legal? Obviously, because many species have been harvested or are damaged as a result of climate, habitat loss, pollution, all the other economic, environmental pressures that are out there, to the point that harvesting them will simply crush the numbers to levels that are no longer sustainable. In fact, the crucial problem with the legal trade is that the sustainability element is often very difficult to pitch just right. And the more demand develops, the more buzz there is around demand, the more entrepreneurs got into promoting traditional Chinese medicine or other aspects, utilization of wildlife, such as for fur coats, the more easily, the more rapidly, the demand spirals out of control and becomes no longer sustainable. So really, the game is managing this enormous and growing human population that's increasingly interacting with wild spaces, that will be interacting with the few remaining wild spaces ever more, and yet managing demand in a way that keeps enough habitat, enough animals, and as great biodiversity as possible together. And that's a big challenge, even in the species that are traded legally. So think of your consumption of beef, right? It's a legal trade. There is cattle rustling. It's sometimes connected to organized crime, but it's a legal trade. Yet there is so much consumption of cattle beef that is absolutely environmentally unsustainable and damaging, with vast repercussions from climate exacerbation to other issues.
So what if we were to just flood the market with, say, rhino horn? Wouldn't that cause the price to crash and kind of fix the problem?
So there are sort of sub-elements of the legal trade. And so one argument one hears is that for species that are targeting very intensely for poachers, like elephants for ivory, or a rhino horn, or rhinos for rhino horn, as you just mentioned, one possibility would be to eliminate the incentives for the poachers and the trafficking organizations that deal with them by crashing the price. I'm deeply skeptical. I wrote a book about wildlife trafficking called The Extinction Market that examined many different tools of one could go about regulating the market. And one of the ones I looked at is the legal trade. And there are good reasons for legal trade, but the one that I don't believe would materialize, would happen, is that you would manage to bring the price down. Because the issue is not just to bring the price down at any one point, but to keep it so low for a long time basis that only the legal trade would be sustainable. But for the high value commodities, for the high value species, many of which derive their value because of their rarity, this is an elusive and, in my view, quite dangerous proposition, even as I believe there should be legal trade. This is not the reason to go for legal trade in these circumstances.
And if I could add to that, I think Vanda's point is so well put that, you know, there are examples where you have species where we can produce so many of them through aquaculture or through orchids, through captive breeding or propagation or something, where you can make the price so low that why would someone go to the wild or import that? But this rarity concept and valuation through rarity really kind of makes it very complex. Anytime you have a species that doesn't have a large population, is slow to reproduce, is very hard to breed in captivity, or some of those factors, what happens is actually as it gets more rare, it gets more valuable. And so unlike another normal commercial market where when things are hard to trade or hard to get, you might collapse that commercial market. The idea that species are rare makes them more valuable to the point where the most valuable one species might be the last of that species, the last individual of that species. So you know, species that are valued because they're rare you have to think of them very differently than you would say think of goldfish or something that, you know, we can produce a lot of. And I think this market is so complex, and I think the complexity is really because of the different peoples that are involved, but also because of the vast difference in species and how they are how they're either produced or their reproductive rates in the wild.
Chris, I see you nodding your head emphatically.
I am, yeah, because I've seen a lot of subjects and seen a lot of investigations, and the driving matter behind that, especially is the critters out there that are more endangered, more threatened, are the ones with the higher value, and that market's going to keep going up. I mean, there are some reptiles and some amphibians. Some of the amphibians I've seen that there's people in the zoo can't even raise, right? So they can't even raise them with the right conditions. Yet you've got subjects saying they're raising them because they're actually legally doing it by raising them themselves, which they can't even do. So yeah, everything you're saying is spot on with it, especially, like if you look at a sturgeon, I said that earlier, it might take that sturgeon 12, 14 years before it's sexually mature. So if you're someone who takes that out of the water and opens it up for the eggs at 8 years old, you've just lost 8 years. And that happens time and time again with different species. They just they can't recover.
And if I can just add one anecdote here, traffickers are stunningly indifferent to driving species to extinction, and maybe even very consciously driving species to extinction. So when I was doing research for my book, The Extinction Market, I traveled to an island in the eastern part of Indonesia, where a special species of parrots, critically endangered out in the wild, was hunted heavily for the Chinese market. And what the traffickers would do is similar to your opening story about the cheetahs. These were very small parrots. They would stuff them in plastic bottles. They would tie the plastic bottles together, put a GPS tracker, and throw them into the ocean, and then get past where the Coast Guard was patrolling, and they would then collect the chain with the plastic bottles. Now, they had 95% mortality. So out of 100 of those parrots, 95 would die before they were even picked up by the boat, by the smuggler's boat. Yet that 5 remaining would bring enough benefit, enough profit to the smuggling organizations that they would be willing to sacrifice, have this incredible smuggling loss. And this is not the rare phenomenon, Andy and Chris, you will see in the smuggling business. This is very different than smuggling a non-perishable good like drugs. The mortality rate, the cruelty of the process is simply stunning.
Yeah, Andy, the live fish trade sees a pretty high mortality rate, right?
Well, it can. I mean, and I think that's part of it is that if you have a trade that's, not concerned about mortality rates, then you'll see a large mortality rate through the supply chain. And the longer those supply chains are, the longer that mortality rate will be. And so and I think fish are another good example of how complex this topic can be. There are trades where there are very, very low mortality rates and the fish are well taken care of and transported through the supply chain. And then there are trades where you have people smuggling things, or you have very long transport chains, and there's not enough value in that, or not enough concern from those middlemen or the supply chain, the exporters, to really be that concerned about mortality, because they can just get more to replace them. And so, I think where that changes is when you have to put things on airlines and you're shipping live animals across the world at air freight prices that are very expensive, and then mortality becomes a real issue. And so there's these two sides of it, to where if there isn't a vested interest by the supply chains to take care of the animals, and that vested interest might be income, or it could be their perception of stewardship of the area, or some other perception. But if there's not a stewardship of those animals through the supply chain, then it is very easy for mortality to creep up. And if there is always a constant supply to fill those in, and there isn't enough value for that, then you can see how that can just turn into a fairly large mortality rate through that chain.
Chris, your work with your undercover work in these sorts of investigations, what have you seen firsthand with, traffickers' interest or lack thereof for keeping animals alive?
I kind of equate it to they are indifferent. It's a dollar sign. So they look at it much different than you would look at something, whether like fish. When I did a big undercover investigation with fish, in the Great Lakes, the people that are violating the laws are looking at them as, they even say it, this dollar sign swimming in the water. So it doesn't, if they kill, and they'd leave nets out that are like 2 mile long, killing thousands of fish if they didn't check them right or didn't handle them right, and it was just part of doing business. On the other side, like turtles, people will stuff these on their body. They'll stuff them in inhumane, areas like socks. They'll put them in these spots where they can hardly breathe on these airlines or ships, containers, sometimes shipping containers that might take weeks to get here. And they'll send 100 so that maybe 10 of them, or 15 or 20 of them make it alive on the other side. And it's just a cost of doing it. They are very indifferent because it's just about money.
Yeah. So speaking of fish, let's talk about totoabas and Mexico. So I don't know where I want to start with this. Maybe let's go to you, Vanda, first. This is an area where we are seeing a big convergence of Mexican drug cartels, Chinese organized crime, all these different things that people do talk about on a more regular basis coming together because of an illegal wildlife trade. Can you tell us a little bit about your research there?
Sure. So totoaba is a type of croaker fish. And what's characteristic, Andy will correct me, of croaker fish is that they have big swim bladders. And those swim bladders are often desired in Asian markets, such as in China, as food and also as forms of speculation. So in China and in some of the Southeast Asian countries, many of the large croaker fish were hunted out because there is such tremendous demand for the mouth, for the bladder, in China. And Chinese traders and trafficking prospectors started looking around the world, else there are large croaker-type species with large swim bladders. And they found them in different parts of the world, including in the Sea of Cortez, which is the Gulf of California, where a species called totoaba lives. Now, totoaba was extensively fished legally in the 1920s, 30s. Lots of it was heading into the United States, the meat, not the bladders. Eventually, the species collapsed and was put on an endangered list. But the species rebounded, even though it stayed on the endangered species list, and entered the Chinese traders, who would start seeing these fish with the large bladder caught as bycatch. And they incentivize the local fishers not to just be catching the totoaba, for which there was not a demand as bycatch, but to start fishing them on purpose for the bladder to be shipped to China. Now, the big problem was that these big, long nets that Chris was talking about, so-called gill nets that are essentially gigantic tennis court-like nets going 2 miles or so would be catching a lot of other stuff, shark, as well as a type of porpoise called the vaquita marina. So the most endangered marine mammal in the world. The latest count this year showed what, I don't know whether the numbers are officially out, but it's under 10. So there are still few left, but the population has dramatically crashed because they are all being caught in these gill nets that are set for for a fish. The vaquita marina is a mammal, is a marine mammal, is a porpoise. Now, so these Chinese traders were organizing this business of catching illegally the totoaba in a place, in a part of Mexico where there is very significant presence of Mexican organized crime groups, specifically two cartels, and most extensively the Sinaloa cartel. So the Sinaloa cartel is one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. It is present on every continent, and its principal business is sending drugs around the world. Cocaine from Latin America, from the Andes to the United States and Europe, fentanyl from Mexico to the United States. The most lethal drug epidemic ever in history is the fentanyl epidemic, today very much fueled by the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. But beyond sending drugs, they have also been taking over territories, legal economies, institutions, and in fact, political offices in Mexico. So the Chinese traders are there, they're telling the fishers, go catch this totoaba, and they're shipping the totoaba bladders to China. And the Mexican cartels are saying, what's going on? Why is there a business in this? And at some point they say, oh no, this is not how the business is going to work. Just like corn, just like avocado, just like timber, just like alcohol sales, everything will go through us. So you Chinese traders can no longer organize the fishers. We will organize the fishers. The fishers can catch the fish, but they'll go through us. We will then sell you the bladders, and then you will take it to China. But the story gets even more interesting. So the totoaba, about a decade and a half ago, was the first fishing economy, along with sea cucumber, in which the cartels became involved. But they learned from it to essentially take over fisheries in Mexico. So today they are trying to extort very large fishing industries, processing plants, take over them. Many of the certificates of fish being sustainable and legally produced are fake, even as they are heading to the United States. And I'll finish with that. The story gets even more complicated. That today, the totoaba bladder, as well as other surprising things like jellyfish, are, as well as timber and other wildlife, are in fact being used by the cartels to pay the Chinese criminal networks for the precursor chemicals from which they produce fentanyl.
Yeah.
Great news.
Chris, what does this mean from the law enforcement side of things?
So I've like personal experience with this. You know, when I was in California for 3 years, I oversaw California, Nevada, all the operations of law enforcement operations for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which includes San Diego, LA, all the big markets. Right there in Tijuana, you know, this is where a vast majority of the totoaba was coming through. We saw a big trend of that. So like we do in other things, when something is such a substantial thing as this, we throw resources at it and try to work undercover to work our way up the chains. You know, it's a very difficult and dangerous thing to do in that area, but we did so. It took a couple of years of time. We worked our way up to buy and sell this totoaba these people to want to do business with us and not worry that we're someone else. To give you an example, the totoaba bladder, dry totoaba bladder, is worth more than any drug that I'm aware of. In an undercover capacity, we bought 12 really good bladders. They grade them differently on their size and everything else. But we purchased 12 bladders for $250,000. And now there's shipment cargo containers of these things that come across that we see that are worth $10 to $20 million or more. You know, they could just come across all the time. Another commodity, it's so easy to hide. It's, you know, very small and light comparatively speaking. They can mix it in with other fish that is legal. You know, there's many, many ways to do it. But we worked our way to do that and then work our way up the channels, on the Chinese side and the cartel side, to where we can get the people that are high up in demand, not the people coming across, as you were talking about before. If you get the people that are coming across and driving across, cartel is paying them $100 to drive that truck across. You're just kind of whacking them all, right? You're just getting, and no one's gonna charge that driver. He doesn't even know what he's driving across. There could be $10 million worth of stuff in there. So if you take that person down and arrest them, you're not getting to the next level. So we want to buy and sell things. We can do that in the Fish and Wildlife, and then work our way up in a couple years time frame, and then take everyone down who's in charge as high as we can go.
How did that investigation end?
It went very well. I mean, we could have kept going. I mean, in some ways, a lot of these investigations, the Great Lakes fishing thing, I could have kept going, but we have statute of limitations. So you basically work up, and a couple of the people are still in the litigation process, but the vast majority of them have pled to the felonies of smuggling and conspiracy to smuggle and Lacey Act violations, which are Fish and Wildlife side. The conspiracy and the money laundering and smuggling charges have a lot more sentencing value than the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Lacey Act, but we've gotten really good restitution and criminal time in jail on those.
So the Lacey Act is a major wildlife law in the U.S. that's actually pretty unique to the U.S., right? Can you just explain real quick what that is?
Sure. The Lacey Act is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife law that's basically related to anything wildlife plant related. So you have any trafficking related offenses are kind of done through the Lacey Act. It's a 5-year felony offense, which compared to smuggling or 10 to 20-year other felonies is smaller in scale, but it's what we have, right? So it's what we can get in, and if there's any wildlife that's transported illegally, sold illegally, imported, exported illegally, the Lacey Act is there, and if it's over $350 value, it's a felony. If it's falsely labeled and it's over that $350 threshold, that's also a felony. Surprisingly enough, we'll work with FBI and HSI a lot, because some of these people are obviously doing money laundering and all these other crimes, drugs, and they'll have like a monkey or something else illegally, and that monkey is the pin that got them, because we were able to get into their house because of the monkey. And then FBI, we see everything else in there, the drugs and guns, and then they do another search warrant, and now these guys get taken down for everything else because they're doing multiple trades.
Yeah, money laundering, financial crimes, that's a very common way to increase penalties, right?
Correct, yeah.
Before we move on, Andy, did you want to add anything about this?
Well, that trade is one of these examples that's so high valued. I don't think there's an answer to it, unless you could produce enough of those fish for some reason and lower the value of it. I mean, having that high valued of a substance is probably not possible for humans today to stop when you have such diverse economies and such global demand. And I think it's an example of how difficult of a problem this is, and it's so layered and multi-complex that you just can't take a simple approach to it. And I mean, we would never shut all trade down to Southeast Asia to try to protect that species. And so while it's unfortunate, and I think we're going to see a lot more of these examples, it's a common example of when you have such high value in the marketplace, it's really, really difficult to change that behavior.
Right. So before we move to the Q&A portion, I want to do a couple rapid round questions with the three of you. If you had a magic wand, Andy, let's start with you, we'll work backwards. If you had a magic wand, what is one thing you would change about the way the wildlife trade is regulated or, demand that could actually help the issue? Magic wand, so dream big.
Right. For me, it's a selfish one because it's something I've been working on for over 10 years, and that is data, and actually having species level data that's required for every organism that's exported or imported in the world. And we don't have anything close to that. So I would love to see a requirement for all species to be properly labeled and data-based.
Great. Chris. Magic wand.
Magic wand. About 10,000 of us. If I could have that many, we'd still be busy. No, I mean.
How many are there?
So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Special Agents, our numbers fluctuate around from 200 to 240. that's worldwide. We have attachés in different countries. We have, we teach International Law Enforcement Academy in Africa and other countries, and there's just 220 of us. We have another 140 or so wildlife inspectors that are uniformed at the ports.
140
100,
to cover all the ports.
Cover all
in
the
US.
ports.
280,000 shipments.
So yeah, there's so many, there's thousands and thousands of shipments that never even get seen, and Customs and Border Patrol are doing their thing, and they often help us in detection a lot of times, but there's not enough of us. We have the model, we have the recipe. We just need more of us to be able to do the work, and it really comes down to Congress and funding and to get us more bodies, really.
Vanda, magic wand.
I would just add here that the resources that the U.S. has, as inadequate as they are for the size of the issues to be dealt with, are vastly ahead of just about any other country in the world. So for me, the magic wand would be to base policy on evidence, but also to build flexibility into policy. Andy very appropriately spoke about the complexity of the issues that we are dealing with. And one of the big complexities of dealing with wildlife trafficking is that out of the many tools that we have, none of them perform significantly better than the other, and all of them often fail far more times than they succeed. There is enormous variation that has to do with the characteristics of the species reproduction that Andy spoke about, but there is also enormous variation in context, in cultural, institutional context. And so to be able to build program and says, we regulate trophy hunting in this way for 2-3 years, and then we take a stock of was it good, was it bad, and we make a decision on that, or we regulate the local communities' sustainable hunting or ecotourism in this place in a certain way, and then we take a stock and reevaluate. And perhaps change policy radically or continue supporting policy without emotions and as hard as it is dealing with this subject, without vested interest. To me, that would be the magic wand to get us to better outcomes.
Great, thank you. All right, one more quick rapid round question for each of you. Tell us a story about a person or an animal or a situation that you encountered in your work that changed the way you think about what you do. Andy.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's a very easy one, actually, because I can remember the exact moment it happened to me. I was at a conference about the marine aquarium trade in 1999, and I met a gentleman named Fernando Cruz from the Philippines that introduced me to the life of Filipino fishermen and how Filipino aquarium fishermen actually worked. And from that moment forward, I instantly understood that if we were going to do something to benefit this trade, we could not just think about the production of species or how to, fish or more sustainably. We actually had to worry about the people and the communities and the livelihoods and the ecosystems as one group. And so for me, I literally remember the moment when I met Fernando and I realized the people that were involved in this throughout the world and the cultures and were so complex that we had to make sure that we thought about the people and the ecosystems together and not as separate things.
Good answer, thank you. Chris.
Wow, there's so many.
I know.
But I think one of the things that surprised me, and I hunt and fish, but when I first came on with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and it's on my profile picture, this pallid sturgeon. When I went out with a biologist and then got to put my hands on this magnificent creature, I had a whole different level of respect for fish in general. And then when I got educated on how important they are to the ecosystem, just one fish, right? One species of fish, and that these things get to be so old and magnificent. They've been around forever. On how important.
Do sturgeon live?
I'm sorry?
How old can a sturgeon?
I mean, I'd correct. I mean, they live like 80 years plus, 100 years, depending on the species. I've held one in Great Lakes that's like 85 years old, and it's looking at that as it's something amazing, and to see that it's so indifferently killed for just possibility of maybe having roe. And I've seen people just net these things and open them up one after another just to see if they have eggs in them, and they're killing decades and decades worth of species. And so that impressed me at that time, and that's why I've done a lot of fish cases as well in the Great Lakes.
Good answer.
Well, so for me, it would be about a quarter century ago when I and my husband were in Namibia for the first time, bird watching in Namibia with a friend of ours who was an ornithologist and passionate conservationist. And we inevitably were speaking about conservation, and it turned out that he was a supporter of trophy hunting. And that really surprised me and really opened my eyes to the importance of economic incentives, local communities, bringing them in, and the complexity of the issues, when not to allow trophy hunting, what not to allow, and what to allow.
Yeah, we could have a very long conversation about trophy hunting.
Yeah, that is separate.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We would like to turn to the Q&A portion now. So if you have a question, Eric will be coming around with a microphone.
All right, just prepare yourself. We're going to turn the lights on. So get ready. There we go. All right, raise your hand and I'll come by with the microphone. Just be sure to hold the microphone close to your mouth, because if not, it's just dead air. So let me start here and we'll go back to you.
Is this an area where citizen science can be helpful in gathering any of the data that you might not be getting now?
Andy?
Well, that's an exceptional question. I think, if you look at the turtle situation in the United States, that is an area where there's been a huge collaboration that started, and I think citizen science has a massive way to go there, and it can help out a lot in the illegal trade of turtles. And I think citizen awareness actually is as important as maybe there's some citizen science that can generate more awareness. Most people in the United States wouldn't be aware that box turtles and other turtles throughout the deciduous forests of the U.S. are being just collected out and shipped out to Asia.
Krista or Vanda, anything to add?
No, it even hits home here, like I mentioned in Kansas City, where the box turtles are 200 and some of them are worth $1.4 million overseas. And so that just propagates them being taken from the wild, stuffed in little boxes, and shipped as household goods overseas. So public awareness is a very important thing.
Good question.
Can either of you speak to shark fin or whale poaching that goes on?
Let's start with shark fin. Those are.
I can.
Go for it, Andy.
Shark fins are another commodity like the tutuaba and other things that have a very high value, very culturally rich value in China, and somewhat complex. There's sustainable shark fishing, and there's shark fish for meat, and then shark's fins will be cut off and traded in that. But it has a large value, and so therefore fishermen are incentivized around the world to basically take the fins off of sharks where they normally would not have kept those animals, and then dried and then shipped. And so we've seen, dozens of species listed on CITES in the last, decade or so because of shark fins, and more. Last year, I think there were 60 or something like that listed to try to reduce the shark fin trade. It's another issue where you have something that's worth so much money, it's going to be very hard to tamper that down. But we're talking numbers in the, tens to 100 million sharks that are caught and traded every year.
I would add two dimensions to it. One is that this is an example where reducing demand is very important and yet extraordinarily difficult. There have been multiple instances where there was a lot of excitement and optimism in the conservation communities that demand went down in very important markets such as China broadly or Hong Kong. Whether because of mercury presence, whether because of campaigns, messaging campaigns to reduce shark fin consumption, or because of decisions of President Xi Jinping to crack down on opulence and corruption. And so we have seen significant dips, but we have also seen the shark fin trade rebounding, demand rebounding. So real complexity to that. Reducing demand for illegal commodities like drugs is very important, but it is really, really hard. The other dimension that I would add to shark fins is this is often a conduit for other criminal activities. Certainly for some of the networks that illegally trade in shark fins, diversify into other animal species, but we are also increasingly seeing quite significant overlap with drug trafficking networks.
Great. Thank you.
All right, we have an online question, and hang on one second. Let me find it. I believe this is for you, Chris. An online viewer asked, "How does the notion of private property in the U.S. affect investigations?"
Boy, ask it. We'll go for the jugular, I guess. No.
Question.
It is kind of like every other crime in that we have. I mean, when you have to weigh the Fourth Amendment, and people's rights to their property are weighed very high, but it also can't be the complete way you can hide behind doing some of these major criminal organizations. So when it comes to curtilage in homes and businesses, we have to get enough probable cause to do search warrants on vast big parts of land. If we have probable cause, we have the ability to go, from Supreme Court. We have the ability to go on there and document that. We don't do that just anything. There's only 200 of us, right? So it has to be like high intelligence, high information, and it is weighed on the information and the level of crime that's involved on what we're going to document. So that's a good question, but it's also a lot of gray areas there.
And wildlife trafficking is not a predicate crime for something like wiretap, right? Which is a significant challenge for you.
For something like what?
For wiretapping, you said?
Oh, wiretapping.
Yeah. So and that's where when we work with HSI, we work with these other agencies, because oftentimes, the cartel's a great example, Chinese businesses and Chinese crime syndicates, they own the markets on these things, and they're doing money laundering, they're doing human smuggling, so they're doing wildlife because they have the market on it, right? So just like you mentioned, they own that Mexican area down there, so in that territory, it's theirs. And so they're funneling all their money laundering, everything through there. So we oftentimes get through, because they're doing multiple crimes, we get through that and other crimes with other agencies, yeah.
All right, we have a question in the back of the room here.
Well, I personally want to know, how do you control your own rage dealing with this kind of situation every day?
Are you asking me?
Just anybody. Yeah, it's just like, greed, human
It's very hard.
And it's just like, and you have not enough agents to work. So how do we help you get more agents? Who do we contact? We can donate to World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and all these other groups. But it sounds like we need to be talking to our senators, and definitely we have a lot going on this year.
Yes, we do.
So, I'd like to know personally how you handle your own feelings dealing with all of this, and who do we need to contact?
I can start really quick, just because I've been undercover in a lot of different situations and for long periods of time. It's very challenging. If I'm having to deal with these criminals like they're my friends, right? So I have to buddy it up with them in order to get that information that I can put them behind bars. So I have to be one of them in a way, and it's like the duality of your purpose. If you come off wrong, you'll be detected. If you're detecting the wrong type of person, you could be dead. So that is very challenging, and that's why certain people are better at undercover things. But yeah, there's a lot of people wouldn't want to save on a ship, but if you're working them. But I know in the long term, I'm going to be able to get them hopefully in court the legal way, and then hopefully we can get enough press. Hopefully we're not as good at that, but we're getting better at that. Is get what we do out so that more people can maybe contact their congressmen and senators, and hopefully get us some more support.
All right, we have another question in the back of the room here.
Zoos are obviously a center for endangered animals that might be subject to illegal trade. Do you think that overall zoos are a positive or a negative influence, as they also encourage that sort of fascination with endangered animals?
And he's smiling.
Yeah,
We could have a whole
this is
panel on
actually
that,
what
too.
I do. So, so when you look at and I think you could look at the big cats or something like that. When people see animals, they have an attachment to them. They're interested in them. And so there is a correlation between people that visit zoos and aquariums and their interest in wildlife in general. But I think the overwhelming majority of the work that zoos and aquariums do is really important conservation messaging and conservation work, and they have an important role to play there. But I think they have to be aware of the past history of zoos and the past history of aquariums and how some of these animals move through these institutions in the past, and educating people, the visitors there, about the serious issues of the wildlife trade, so that people don't necessarily want to have animals like big cats or other things they might see at a zoo.
And I would just add to that of course there is great variation in the quality of regulation and monitoring of the zoos. Some of which, such as in Asia or the Middle East, are massive vectors of the laundering of wildlife. They claim that the wildlife has come from, say, breeding program, but in fact, the animals are caught in the wild, they're nominally brought to the zoo, and then they're sent on. So well-designed, well-monitored zoos focused on conservation are a crucial asset. Not well-monitored zoos in areas with poor law enforcement and poor regulations can be a huge vector of wildlife trafficking and poaching.
Yeah, and I think that's this idea of, how does the public know what's a good zoo or a bad zoo, right? Because it's so hard for people to understand, like, when they're contributing to something like this versus when they're helping a conservation purpose. And so that's where I think public education or public knowledge or awareness of these issues and what accreditation means and what some conservation organizations are. And so that you don't go to the roadside stand that says they're a zoo, that you actually go to a zoo that has veterinarians and scientists and they're conservationally focused. That's so important. But it's really, and it varies a lot throughout the world.
Yeah, so a quick note on that. In the US, for example, any facility that displays animals to the public is supposed to be permitted by the USDA, but the highest regulated zoos and aquariums are those that are accredited by a private organization called the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the AZA. So if you want to, make sure you're going to something that's on the much more legit, beneficial side of things, look for AZA accreditation.
Yeah, and they often help us. They often help us with, when we bring in animals, they take care of them throughout the investigation, find homes for them sometimes. Other times, unfortunately, they might care for them the rest of their life because they can't be released. Like turtles can't be released back because they have these different types of diseases or things that they carry.
And just to make sure that people understand my conflicts here, I actually run a program in aquarium science and sit on some committees for AZA and work in this area quite heavily. And so AZA is a very important organization that accredits zoos in the United States and throughout the world. And that accreditation is really that certificate of saying that they're not just, that they have some standards and they're concerned about conservation and these other issues. That makes them very, very different from, say, a roadside stand or a zoo that is trafficking in wildlife.
And that's not to say they're, they have their critics, of course. When you start talking about like highly sentient animal, well, all animals are sentient. But when you start talking about animals like elephants or chimpanzees and things like that, you get into discussions about animal welfare, animal rights, personhood, things like that, then that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, baseline, if you're looking for a place you want to feel like okay about, look for AZA accreditation.
All right, we're a little past our time limit here. Let's do one more question. Let's do two more. We got one in-person question, and then I've got a question from an online viewer that I think will be a great question to put a bow on the conversation tonight.
Yes, I heard the late Franz de Waal talk about research on fish, that they have a sense of justice. Do you know what the latest research on that is?
I feel like that one's for you,
Andy,
Andy.
we're looking at you.
I do a little bit with animal welfare in my classes and things like that, but I am not up to speed on some of these the issues like, that in fish. And so I don't want to actually speak on that because I use that work and use welfare examples and animal welfare in my classes, but I don't actually do work in that area of fish. And I don't want to speak as a scientist on that area.
Can you tell us maybe just a little bit about what we do know about fish and their sense of their sentience?
Sure. So, I mean, I think people need that fish vary a lot in across the species and some fish, people will recognize their personalities or consider what their behavior personality, but it's widely understood now through the work that we've done with fish that fish feel pain and have far more senses and far more capabilities than we once thought they did. And so, I think from my standpoint, humans tend to humanize every animal we see. That's just what we do. But we also have to understand that humans have evolved from all of these animals, and biodiversity is so huge that we can't understand what an organism necessarily is feeling or thinking or if they, but we can look at the molecular background and the history of them and see that they have the same pathways that we have in many areas. And so, and behavioral ecologists do studies that show their behavior may react certain ways with other things. And so I think we have to, from my standpoint, we have to make the assumption that organisms, should be cared for and taken care of as if they were primates or humans or those things, so that they're well taken care of if we're going to have them in captivity.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's end with this one. We have an online viewer who asks, what inspires the panelists to do the job they do? And let me tweak that a little bit too. We've heard a lot of depressing stuff tonight. So let me add to that question. Is there something that gives you hope for the future?
Vanda?
Well, every time I go out into the wild, every time I can bird watch, every time I see a dolphin or a fish, it gives me both hope but a sense of purpose. That we as humans do not exist unto ourselves. We are intimately connected to the planet. Our future depends on the planet. And we need to care for the planet for ourselves, but also for others.
Chris?
I mean, real quick. I was raised in, going out camping, raised, canoeing and hiking and backpacking ever since I can remember. So that's why it really brought me into nature, is being just the love of it. But I'll end though with the 3 different times I've been to Africa for International Law Enforcement Academy, teaching over there. I was blessed with, and anyone who can go there to go to the Okavango Delta in northern Botswana, where it is like it was 200,000 years ago. There aren't fences there. These animals are walking around from me to you, from zebra to different species of deer, and I can't even explain the majestic feeling I have there. It rejuvenated me into a purpose, and keep that going to help. I have a lot of hope for the future, because we can, as a collective group, do a lot, here and abroad, and help these species. So,
Andy?
Yeah, I think it's that sense of wonder that you can see in the biodiversity of the world. And for me, I'm a scientist. I study organisms and raise a lot of species, and so just working on larval development or other things with these species and understanding how they develop and how they fit inside of a very complex system and how complex that system is. And it just gets more complex the more you study it, and the longer you spend working on it, it seems like it's more complex and more complex. And then you travel to other parts of the world and you meet fishermen who are fishing for these species and making a livelihood off of that, and educating their kids and feeding themselves, and making their lives more, they're able to provide a livelihood for themselves off of a sustainable trade. To me, that gives me hope. And I will speak to the, kind of, somebody asked about what do we do about our sense of rage, and I would actually say that it's a large sense of grief that you experience when you study things like coral reefs and you've watched them decline over 25 years. It's not necessarily an easy thing to see and to know what's going to happen to those in the future, but you have to kind of pick out your highs when you can and kind of hang on to those and enjoy those and try to make a bit of a difference where you can.
Great, thank you.
Rachel, what about you?
Oh, me? Let's see. I would say for me, it's a sense of justice, which is why I got into investigative journalism in the first place. It's very much be a voice for the voiceless kind of situation. And that's what keeps me going as I report on wildlife, because it is. I mean, the rage and the grief can be overwhelming. And so you just keep in mind, like, hopefully what I'm doing is going to make some little difference.
Well, thank you all, Rachel, Christopher, Vanda, Andrew. It's a depressing topic, but as I mentioned in my intro, I think it's one that needs to be talked about more. So thank you so much for taking the time to travel to Kansas City to be with us. And thank you all for attending the program tonight. Visit lindahall.org and irckc.org for information about all of our upcoming events. Thank you, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Kristen.